Hello everyone. We're going to be talking about the midpoint formula today. We're actually going to use it to determine the distance and the middle of the values of our 2 points here, so our 3 points. So a midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. It is the exact middle point of a segment, and then the midpoint is found by averaging the endpoint coordinates. So you have the midpoint, so that's what M stands for. We could say this is midpoint. And then our actual formula, we wrote this down, but you basically have the big number plus the small number. And then you're taking the average, so there was two values that we added together, and we're going to divide by 2. And that will be your midpoint. So what it's doing is talking about the endpoints. So my endpoint is negative 13 here, and my other endpoint is 6 here. So the larger number in this case would be 6. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the coordinate of the midpoint AB, segment AB, in figure 1. So we want to actually figure out what that coordinate is. So the midpoint right here, we're splitting it into two congruent parts. So I'm going to take 6 plus a negative 13. And remember, 6 plus a negative 13, we end up actually getting 6 minus 13. So we get a negative 7. And then we divide that by 2, which equals a negative 3.5. Okay. For this value here, we have, so negative 3.5 is our segment for AB. So then what this means is that our negative 3.5, that's actually the midpoint of our two endpoints. So we're at negative 1 here. We go to negative 2, and then negative 3. Actually, maybe I'll make the negative 3. And then we'd be about negative 3.5. So we're going to be about right. Let me actually draw this a little better. So if we look, we're about at negative 3.5 right here, and that should be the middle, so that these two sides are congruent. So negative 3.5 would be the value that's the midpoint, okay, on this figure here. So now we're going to find the coordinate of the midpoint for just BC. So we're trying to figure out that middle point of where would be right between that segment BC. So now these are my endpoints. So I'm going to have a 6 plus a negative 1, and we have technically 6 minus 1, which equals 5. We're going to divide that by 2, and we get 2.5. So now our midpoint between that segment BC, so if you see that we have negative 1 here, pretend that this is our segment. We have 6, this was C, this is B. So now at a positive 2.5, so negative 1, 0, 1, 2, a little bit more, so 2.5 would be our midpoint. I'm going to put M for our midpoint, M for my midpoint there. Okay, so now we're going to find the other endpoint of a segment instead of a midpoint, but this time we're given the midpoint of negative 2 and then the endpoint of negative 6. So we have our formula. I'm going to draw a picture here. Our midpoint directly in the middle is negative 2, and one of our endpoints is negative 6. So I think, would a negative 6 go over here or over here? It actually has to go over here. We get higher and higher negatives as we go below, and you get higher positive numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, as you go right. So this is what our figure actually looks like. We're trying to determine what this value is, that the other endpoint there. So what we're going to do is this will be the higher number, so we're going to do x plus my lower number of negative 6, and then we are going to divide that by 2, and then we're going to set it equal to negative 2. So that's because, remember, your midpoint is always equal. These were all midpoints, so that's where my midpoint would also be plugged into the formula here. So then now I need to solve for x. This is being divided. In order to get rid of division, we need to multiply everything, both sides of the equal sign, by 2. So these divide out because 2 divided by 2 is 1. We're left with x plus a negative 6 equals negative 2 times 2 is a negative 4. We are still not done solving for our x. I'm just going to rewrite this how we've been writing it. So positive times a negative is a negative. So now I have x minus 6 equals negative 4. Since this is a negative sign, the inverse operation of that is addition. So I need to add 6 to both sides, and I get x equals 2. So now my midpoint, or my endpoint, I'm sorry, my endpoint equals 2. And that's what this value right here would be. Okay, so that's our endpoint there. So what you guys could check is look at how many spaces are there between -2 to 6. So -2, -3 is 1, -4 is 2, -5 is 3, and -6 is 4. Then if I were to count from -2 to 2, I should also have 4 spaces. So -1, 0, 1, and then 2. So that is actually our midpoint, making it 2 congruent sides, segments there. All right, so now we're going to do given the endpoint again. So given our endpoint, we have 4, a midpoint of -1. We need to find the other midpoint. The reason why I have an x here is because I know that 4 is a larger point, and then -1 is going to be the midpoint. So I'm going to do the same thing. This time this is my larger point, 4, and then we're going to add the smaller one, which we don't know what that value is, divide by 2 because we're taking the average, equals our midpoint of -1. Again, we're going to multiply both sides by 2 of our equation sign so that we get 4 plus x equals a -2. Now I need to get x by itself. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and I get x equals -6. So yay, I was right. We do have an endpoint of -6. -1 was our midpoint there. And again, if you were to count from -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, that was 5 points. And then -1 to 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we also get a length of 5 here. So that's how you guys determine midpoints given endpoints. The midpoint formula, this is just on a segment here. So then we're also going to talk about midpoints on an actual coordinate plane. So the coordinate planes are the ones that look like this, where you have your quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so these are your quadrants, and that's a coordinate plane. So this time, if you have A equal x1, y1, and your B is going to equal x2, y2, then your midpoint M of that segment AB is going to be found by actually averaging, taking the average again, the endpoint coordinates. So you basically take that, find the average of your x values, and then take your y values, find the average of your y values. Go over some examples. So on number 5, what you're going to do is the coordinate of the midpoint of the segment with the given endpoints. So again, these are your points on a graph. So what this would look like, you guys, you have -3, and then we're going to go up 7. So -3, 7, and then 5, 1. So there's your segment on an actual coordinate plane. And those are your 2 endpoints, and it's segment J and K. So what we're going to do is determine those midpoints. So I'm just going to title this as your x1, x2, y1, y2, just like as if we were finding the slope. And now what we're going to do is plug it into our formula here. So m equals, and then I have my large parentheses, x1 was a -3, plus my x2, which is the 5, divide that by 2, because that's going to be our average of our x values. Then we're going to find our y values. So y1 was 7 plus the y2, which is 1. Find the average of our y values. So go ahead and take these separately. -3 plus 5. We end up getting 2 divided by 2. We'll do this in a second. And then 7 plus 1 is 8 divided by 2. Now I'm going to go ahead and divide each of these by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, comma, 8 divided by 2 is 4. So what this is, this 1, 4, this is the actual midpoint on our coordinate plane here. So if I were to go 1, 1, 2, or sorry, positive 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, then we actually have the midpoint of our, on our coordinate plane. So let me show you guys that. Okay, I was just wondering, I actually plotted this K point value, right? Hopefully those of you guys that saw this on their graph. So let's go ahead and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this one was right, -3, 7. That's my J value. But then 5, I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then up 1. I was wondering why that was not on our graph for that midpoint. So there's our value. And then now our 1, 4 should be the midpoint of our actual segment. So 1, we go to the right one, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So yay, this looks about the midpoint of our two congruent sides and our midpoint of that value there. So that's our midpoint of our actual segment on a coordinate plane. Let's do that one more time. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my coordinate plane real fast. Let's actually do this correctly this time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're going to go -2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the right, and then we're going to go down -2. That's my point A. And then we're also going to go 5, 0, which is a tiny little segment there, so B. So we need to figure out the midpoint of that segment now. So we're going to label these x1, y1, x2, y2. Once we label those, we can now plug it into our midpoint formula. X1 was 5 plus x2, which is 5. Divide that by 2, comma, x2 is 0, plus a -2, which is 0 minus 2. That's okay, we'll do this in a second. So now 5 plus 5 is 10. Still keep that divided by 2 because we're not there yet. 0 plus a -2, positive times a negative is a negative. So 0 minus 2 is going to be -2. Divide by 2. 10 divided by 2, we get 5. And -2 divided by 2, a negative divided by positive is a negative. So we get 5, -1. So if I go over 5 and only go down 1, yay, I see that that's my midpoint. So I actually did do that one correctly. Okay, so now I'm actually going to show you guys an actual graph here. And then once we do the graphs, you guys will be able to, I'm only going to do one of them so that you guys can practice the other one in class with us. So use the given endpoint A and the midpoint M of the segment AB to find the coordinates of the other endpoints. So now on these ones, we were actually figuring out the midpoints of our formulas here. This time, remember how we found the endpoints here? We're going to find the endpoints on this one. So we need to solve algebraically with the midpoint formula. I provided the midpoint formula for you guys here. And then we're going to graph to show that our answer was actually correct. So what we're going to do, we need to actually label our number 7, x1, y1, x2, y2, and then we're going to plug that into our midpoint formula. So remember, M stands for midpoint. So this point here is actually our 1, 3. So we already found the midpoint, but now we're going to plug in. So this is actually just our x1. This is, I apologize. This is not your x2. These are your midpoints of midpoint 1, midpoint 3. So that actually 1, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this should hopefully be the midpoint of our segment. I'm going to title this M. And then our other value of -2 and then 1, we have our A value. So this is one of our endpoints. That'll be our middle, and then we'll see where we're going. So we're only going to plug this in for our x1. So -2. We don't know what our x2 is, so we need to just leave x there, divide by 2, comma, our y1 is the 1, plus our y divided by 2. Whoa, okay, so we have two different equations here that we need to actually solve for these averages. So our average of our x value is 1 here. So we're going to have 1 equals -2 plus x divided by 2. So once we have our 1, we need to now solve for x. So all I did, you guys, just to back up, I took my averages of my x. This was the average value of our x. So now I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. 2 times 1 is 2. These divide out because 2 divided by 2 is 1. We get -2 plus x. I'm going to add 2 to both sides because that was originally a negative. So now I have 4 equals x. So that's going to be one of the values here. I'm going to use as my endpoint. And now my second equation is the y's. So the average of my y's happens to be 3. So I'm now going to take my separate equation, and 1 plus y divided by 2 equals 3. You guys can put these on either side, it's okay. Multiply both sides by 2 because that's what's in the denominator there. That divides out, so I get 1 plus y. 3 times 2 is 6. We're going to subtract 1 because that was a positive 1, and I get y equals 5. So if we look at here, this is my endpoint. And remember, x and y are your actual values, so 4, 5. So let's actually graph this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, sorry, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this should be my other midpoint. Yay, it is. It's actually in the midpoint there. This is my midpoint value B. It actually already set it up here for me. So this is my endpoint. Therefore, I actually found it. It is correct. This is the midpoint of that segment AB. All right, you guys, I want you to go ahead and finish and actually try that one on number 8. We will go over it in class together, and I will see you in class.